We will be hearing from Kyra, Streck, Ginger, Stanciel, Joshua Stein, and their topic is fashion forward, centering dresses, fashion history, a museum exhibition.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. We just want to reiterate the ISCORE mission. The ISCORE project supports the Iowa State University's diversity efforts, and the project provides positive interactions and dialogue regarding race, ethnicity, and multicultural relations through local and national initiatives, including participation in 2 conferences, ISCORE and ISCORE. We also want to include a land acknowledgement provided by ISCORE as well. We were going to include one too, so we just got rid of ours, but we would like to begin this event with land acknowledgement. Iowa State University is located on the ancestral lands and territory of the Buckojay or Iowa Nation. The U.S. obtained the land from the Meskwaki and Sac Nations and the Treaty of 1842. We wish to recognize our obligations to this land and to the people who took care of it, as well as the 17,000 Native people who live in Iowa today. So thank you for coming to our presentation on our exhibition at Iowa State University's Textiles and Clothing Museum, titled Fashion Forward, Centering Justice in Fashion History. So we launched the digital exhibition July 30th, 2021 using Microsoft Sway, which is an open access platform hosted at Iowa State. So if you'd like to visit the full digital exhibition and its interactive elements, you can scan the QR code or just check out the link when you have time. And we'll also put it in the chat for people that are watching at home. So myself, Kyra Streck, Ginger Stanciel, Joshua Simon, Dr. Reddy-Best, and Dr. Gordon curated the exhibition. The 3 of us are master's students in the apparel, merchandising, and design program, and hold the endowed Agatha Kuchenbecker-Burnett graduate teaching and research assistantship in the Textiles and Clothing Museum. Dr. Reddy-Best is an associate professor in apparel merchandising and design, and also the director and curator at the Textiles and Clothing Museum. Dr. Gordon is a lecturer in apparel merchandising and design, and also serves as our digital curator for the museum.
So the concept for this exhibition originated from the development of our museum's new mission statement, which centers commitments to social justice as well as intersectionality in the study of fashion history. So in this exhibition, we aimed to reinterpret object highlights from the collection through this critical lens, as well as acknowledge intersections with historically marginalized communities to tell justice-oriented histories. So a number of museums and institutions have aligned with the #MuseumsAreNotNeutral movement, which promotes the idea that museums operating as well as collecting policies are rooted in colonial oppressive practices, which are linked to broader systemic societal issues. Through our exhibition, we actively reject discriminatory practices, as well as uplift marginalized voices and stories to create a more socially just and equitable fashion history narrative.
So in this exhibition, we analyzed 20 objects selected from the 2013 published exhibition catalog, Treasures of the Textiles and Clothing Museum. These objects range in date from the 18th to the 21st century and were deemed important objects and stories. The previous curators mounted the exhibition and published the corresponding catalog. We reinterpret these objects through an intersectional, justice-oriented lenses.
We identified 6 themes, which are seen here, and we'll highlight each by discussing one object per theme. Okay. In the first theme, we examine the concepts of cultural appropriation and imperialism. Cultural appropriation refers to the taking, borrowing, reframing, and or utilizing of creative expressions from one cultural group by another without giving credit to the source community or the significance of the design to this community. In this theme, we investigate the complex entanglements of a globalized fashion system and how the producers of the objects featured in this theme drew upon elements of cultures distant near to and from their own. So in this theme, we interpret a textile sample designed by William Morris dating to the late 19th century. So scholars argue that what is now called chintz in the United States and Europe originated in either India or Egypt at least 2,000 years ago. Chintz, as it is known in India, kalamkari, became incredibly popular in Europe, especially Britain. To satisfy European consumers, Indian artisans began tailoring the print to fit European aesthetics. William Morris, the designer of the sample, began his textile company in 1861, and he quickly became a leading British textile designer. Despite the textile's origins in Indian artistry, chintz has colloquially become associated with British culture and the British countryside in design. Okay. Okay. Yeah. So despite the textile's origins in Indian artistry, chintz has colloquially become associated with British culture and the British countryside, and the romanticization of British culture as well. Hence whitewashing and flattening the textile's unique and complex history.
So in the next theme, we examine objects with heightened attention to racial inequities. So racial inequity is prevalent in social systems throughout history, including Western fashion. So white supremacy has led to extreme violence against people of color. The stories we tell of objects within this theme highlight these inequities through the lens of fashion. In many cases, the provenance of these objects also highlights the pronounced overrepresentation of material culture connected to the white and well-to-do within museum collections. So Eric C. Wilson, a white-appearing former University of Iowa student, wore this Olympic sweater and cap in the 1924 Summer Olympics. He competed for Team USA in the 400-meter dash amongst a total of 3,088 athletes, of which only 135 were women. Wilson's track and field teammates, D. Hart Hubbard, pictured here on the right, and Ned Gordon, pictured on the left, were African-American broad jumpers and won gold and silver, respectively. The stories and objects of marginalized individuals like Hubbard and Gordon often have been neglected. The Ted Stevens Act of 1978 aided in addressing some Olympic team inequities, spurring more women and people of color to be accepted onto Team USA, but notably did not extend to LGBTQ+ identifying athletes, who still experience exclusion and discrimination in many sports today. We also examined objects with heightened attention to socioeconomic and class barriers. The concept of socioeconomic class affects museums' historical collection practices of seeking out high-quality, lavish objects owned or worn by wealthy individuals. Through the object stories within this theme, we decenter this dominant high socioeconomic class narrative by focusing on the class barriers faced by many individuals when fashioning the self. Throughout history, some North American and European women have opted for quality, fashionable dresses that can be worn for more than one occasion, such as this ensemble. Mary Makepeace Nichols wore this circa 1885 dress in a ceremony officiated by Henry Ward Beecher, the famous pastor and abolitionist. In doing so, she followed in that tradition of practicality. While contemporary United States society thinks of white wedding gowns as a long-standing tradition, Queen Victoria popularized the wearing of white for weddings in her 1840 wedding, which is featured on the left. The image on the right is a close-up of Queen Victoria's wedding dress. It wasn't until the 1950s that white wedding dresses became popular amongst all social classes, with many Western brides during the first half of the 20th century opting for ensembles that could be worn multiple times.
In our next theme, we re-examine objects with attention to issues related to environmental justice. Activists at Green Action define environmental racism as the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. Fashion brands, retailers, and manufacturers are some of the leading contributors to environmental justice issues, as they often pollute waterways with toxic dyes and other discarded materials near low-income housing or neighborhoods and communities of color in the US and abroad. In this theme, we explore environmental racism of the past and center environmental justice in the pursuit of safe living spaces for low-income people and communities of color. Featured in the exhibition is this collage from the late 18th century. Although we are unsure of the green pigment chemistry used on this collage, in the 18th and 19th centuries, dyers often used arsenic dust as pigment on clothing, furniture, wallpaper, and toys. Scientists established the dangers of using arsenic pigments by the early 19th century, but Paris green and similar compounds remained popular through the end of the 1800s. These two images depict the environmental and health dangers of green arsenic dyes during the 19th century. The medical illustration shows the impact of arsenic dyes on a patient's hand and arsenic poisoning. And the political cartoon mocks the use of arsenic and dancing the waltz, comparing the perceived moral dangers of waltzing and the physical dangers of arsenic pigmented fabrics.
So next, we examined women and feminism. Women in Western cultures have historically been subjected to sexist and patriarchal oppression. That is, they are treated as inferior to men. Feminists have brought much attention to and brought societal change regarding this subjugation since about the mid-19th century. Women with compounding marginalizations have not historically had their needs considered in mainstream, white, heteronormative, ableist, and middle to upper class feminism among citizens. Through the objects we feature in this theme, we illustrate past efforts to combat women's oppression, as well as to aim to center intersectionally marginalized women's positions in society. So we featured this lingerie dress from circa 1905 in this theme. White was a prominent color worn by suffragettes who participated in protests and marches, with some wearing lingerie dresses similar to this circa 1905 example, and others wearing white suit ensembles. Suffrage efforts proved successful, with some women becoming eligible to vote in 1920. Black, Indigenous, and women of color were barred from voting due to a variety of laws and discrimination targeting specific races, ethnicities, and people who could not read or write the English language. Some intersectionally marginalized women were still prevented from voting over 50 years after their white English-speaking women counterparts began voting, issues which continue to persist into the 21st century. Recently, Congresswomen have worn white ensembles to several State of the Union addresses in a visual demonstration of solidarity that references the wearing of white by suffragettes. These two images represent demonstration for women's suffrage and women's rights 107 years apart. The image on the left depicts US Democratic Congresswomen wearing white at President Trump's State of the Union address in 2019, and the image on the right shows the Women's Political Union March for Suffrage in 1912. In the final theme of our exhibition, we examine the concept of shifting masculinities. The gender binary, or woman-man, is a hallmark of Western social systems. The binary puts forth strict definitions of particular genders that are tied to sex assigned at birth. In this theme, we focus on conceptions of masculinity and how they have varied throughout time in Western contexts. Through these stories, the absence of traditional ideas of masculinity is apparent, as each period has had its own unique ideas surrounding masculinity as well as self-presentation. The final object, tailor-made from circa 1910, exemplifies societal shifts in traditionally gendered dress. So drawing influence from men's suits, some tailor-made ensembles in the late 19th and early 20th centuries blurred the boundaries between masculinity and femininity. Considering this, tailor-mades may have been considered by some as the uniform of the independent working woman. There were debates between whether or not these were acceptable modes of dress, but despite these debates, the mannish mode continued in various forms for several decades into the 20th century, notably in the 1930s. So in closing, we want to emphasize how centering social justice within fashion history is vital. The stories in this exhibition are a few of the many often omitted from dominant narratives about the history of fashion. Countless voices and stories still have yet to be heard, but many museums are making important shifts towards centering justice in their exhibition content, online content, as well as their guiding principles. We hope to inspire you in the future to continue thinking about representation of marginalized experiences, as well as to take action in promoting equity.
For access to our full reference list, please visit the digital exhibition website. And we would like to extend a special thanks to the following individuals for assisting in making this exhibition possible and providing critical feedback throughout the research and development process. We deeply value ongoing collegial dialogue and want to thank Sarah Marchetti and Jen Fitzpatrick for authoring and curating Treasures of the Textiles and Clothing Museum in 2013. We also express appreciation for the endowed Agatha Hubenbecker Burnett Graduate Student Assistantship, which funded us to create this exhibition. Thank you, and please visit our digital or physical exhibition, which is in the Mary Alice Gallery in Morrill Hall, to learn more.
If there aren't any questions, let's thank the presenters again. And then don't forget to evaluate the session on the Google app.
And we'll stick around if you guys. Collection that you would like to see featured as a balance to the historically common narrative of fashion? That's a really good question.
Yeah, sure. And if you guys want to add anything, of course, you can do that. But so there are objects in the collection that are. We focus mainly on a very specific set of objects that were deemed important by previous curators and stewards of the collection. Because a lot of what has historically been valued is objects from dominant narratives. That's a lot of like what we teach, we're like, oh, the new look, beautiful dresses, evening wear, couture from the past, but who is really wearing these, who had access to these, is a very small group of people, especially women that were heterosexual, rich, white. So these were often the objects that were centered in this curated exhibition from 2013 that we were analyzing. So we were kind of working from that. So most of those objects were not centering, they were centering kind of dominant narratives in fashion. So we were really reinterpreting those. But there are some objects in the collection that are a little bit, were collected with more like justice oriented narratives in mind. And we're certainly collecting right now, we have a new mission statement. So we're trying to start collecting more objects that are in line with our mission statement. Such as right now we're collecting some objects from trans individuals. So yeah, do you have anything?
And I think that it's definitely really important to realize that while Kyra was talking about how we're reinterpreting objects, I think that one big takeaway that we've learned from giving this presentation several times and having ongoing dialogue about this is that a lot of collections that do have these historic collecting practices of centering this common narrative, I think that this is a really great example of how you can really showcase in these marginalized stories, even if your collection doesn't have socially just objects or things that represent necessarily these marginalized individuals. This is a way to kind of reinterpret stories and really highlight these not really talked about narratives. And I think that that's especially really important in museums and when we're talking about fashion history, because if you look at fashion history textbooks and so forth and publications about them, a lot of times it really does still kind of center this very like wealthier narrative. I know we TA a fashion history course and we've had to implement extra credit opportunities to kind of really showcase other sides of fashion history that aren't necessarily covered in this very common narrative that's really portrayed in textbooks. I do think that the industry and museums and fashion history, as we kind of talked about in the beginning, they're definitely getting better. And I'm really excited. I know we're all really excited about kind of being a part of that and really pushing forward marginalized narratives and social justice in museums and fashion history.
I also just want to add really quick to something that Ginger said. So in some of the presentations we've given, members of the audience have been a part of smaller collections or collections that or museums that might not have as many resources as we do. And they were really excited about the project because they were like, we don't have the resources to be collecting, you know, more socially justice oriented objects. We have the objects that we have, and some of the previous collecting processes may not have considered marginalized narratives, but we can use what we have to be able to tell and help expose people to the ideas about what is a dominant narrative, what are hegemonic narratives, and shifting that focus a little bit more to marginalized individuals.
Any more questions, you can drop them in the chat for those of you online in person. If you would like to ask any questions, if not, we'll give it a few minutes. And I think that's Yep.
Yeah, so one of the main things was looking at kind of like how we had, so one of the objects that we have a lot of is these different lingerie dresses. And a lot of them in a lot of like past exhibitions that we've looked at were a lot of the times about like garden parties or like wearing them as a fancy dress to graduation, or talking about the history of lace, which certainly has, you know, a place, but it's again kind of reinforcing those like dominant ideas. So we kind of tried to take it from an angle where like, how can we talk about like a lingerie dress in a way that is more so socially justice focused. And so when we were doing some research about them, we saw that there were women that would use like lingerie dresses they already had because they couldn't afford to, you know, go out and buy new outfits that the suffrage union was asking them to wear. So they would wear lingerie dresses as a way to kind of be able to participate, as well as show unity in those kind of demonstrations for suffrage. So that was one of the ways we did that. But then we also wanted to kind of address too, because we knew that like looking at like first wave feminism, that initial suffrage and the way that like it was really centered on like white interest and specifically white women's interest, wealthy white women. We wanted to make sure that we still contextualize that. So I guess overall, I guess I would say we gleaned that there's like multiple ways to kind of think through these things rather than this like one way of just fancy dresses, but also like the way that clothing can be used as a political tool, I suppose.
We have a couple more questions from the chat. So one question is, how old does something have to be for you to consider it part of a museum collection? So I just want to plug really fast. We have 3 new Exhibition's opening April 8th, if anyone is interested. So Josh is focusing on, I mean, you can, okay. Well, Josh's is focusing on a Cuban bisexual designer who's often omitted from fashion history. And then Ginger's is focused on powerful women throughout history and power politics and how clothing has been used for that. But mine is focusing on how trans individuals use underwear and make their own underwear to express themselves in the field gender affirmation. And a lot of how people learn to do it nowadays is through YouTube. So for my project, I emailed some YouTubers and was like, can you make some for me so I can exhibit it? So some of the objects that we have are from last week. It can be any time because we also want to have objects for the future that show now and can show contemporary history and highlight the different social movements that are going on, the different identities that are present, the different, I mean, they've always been present, but that are have more of a voice today, especially my research, I look at it through the internet and how marginalized communities use the internet to build community. So they don't necessarily have to be old. A lot of collecting, traditional collecting is choosing objects that are older, but it is also important to document contemporary history, especially for the future. When they look at today, they can have some different kinds of ideas about different narratives that are going on today that might otherwise not be collected. Do you have anything to add to that?
And just some kind of quick history about our collection at the Textiles and Clothing Museum on campus. It was founded and the collection started by Olive Settles in the 1920s, who is a professor here in the AMD, what's currently the AMD department. And I think that it's really important to know that this collection's been around since the 20s. And as Kyra said, we want to keep it around for another 100 years. So collecting what's current is really important, but also preserving what we still have in the collection. And above all, our collection is a teaching collection. So we really want to make sure that students are getting this well-rounded insight into fashion history. And that really focuses with our new mission, aligns with our new mission about social justice and representing marginalized individuals and communities. So we definitely really want to make sure that we're trying to hit all of our bases in our new collecting practices and mission. There's another comment in the chat. So somebody said, now your comments are making me think about how Native American clothing is generally presented with a historical/anthropological lens rather than a fashion lens. So that's actually a really good point. So we definitely have talked about that and had conversations about that in some of our graduate courses and read literature on this and books on this as well. And I think that this is a really fair point. And I think that that's something that you're starting to see museums try to kind of move away from that. And what we'd kind of call that, and we've observed in some of our other research, is that's kind of a concept known as othering, which is kind of when you're decentering, when the dominant narrative we've talked about is that very typically European, Western culture, white, well-to-do, and kind of separating Native American history as another thing. And I think that there's definitely a lot of curators and collection people nowadays that are trying to kind of bring the fold back in. And I think that that was something that we observed when looking at the treasures of the Textiles and Clothing Museum catalog book originally, was that kind of separation. Obviously, as we move forward in the museum world, you're going to constantly see changes and adaptations to policies and concepts. And this is a big one that's happened in the last few years of really trying to reintegrate and kind of stay away from othering cultures that are different from ours.
And to be totally transparent, we actually, as a museum, have two separate collections. We have this collection that we've shown that's more of the dominant fashion history objects and other objects that are trying to show marginalized narratives. And then we also have, literally housed in a separate building, another room for, it's literally called the ethnic textile collection. So we're trying to change that. We're working on that. It's difficult because there's, everyone who works at the museum now is really for that. But there are some difficult university and donor politics related to that. And also we need the space. So how are we going to really divide up objects, but we at least want to change the name and are trying to be really conscious about in the future, trying to not create such a divide because it does create othering. But we'll see what that will end up looking like. But hopefully there will be some exciting developments that are more social justice oriented and more equitable and less othering and less like ethnic textiles. Something else I wanted to add. Oh, there's a book called Native Fashion Now that we read for one of our courses. I think it's AMD 562. If any of your students and have time left and want to take that, it's about fashion and social justice. So we read this book called Native Fashion Now. That was a product of an exhibit, I think at the Peabody, and it explores, it tries to lessen the othering of Indigenous designers in North America and highlight some designers throughout history who have been impactful in kind of the mainstream scene, and also Indigenous designers now that are creating really cool items, really cool fashion that might be influenced by their heritage, but isn't kind of the like stereotyped historical, like totally whitewashed like idea that people often have about Indigenous North American fashion, and like that it's so othered. I think people are trying to do really cool stuff now and always have been doing cool stuff. So that's really what this book and this exhibition highlights. So again, that's called Native Fashion Now, if anyone's interested. I think it's like a little bit of it's got like full color pages, so you might want to check it out from the library because I think it's like, you know, kind of expensive, but it's really cool. It highlights a lot of really cool designers. And it has kind of explanations that are really interesting of how they come up with their designs and how their identity influences their designs and their experiences influence what they decide to make. So.
When you were sharing about the suffragette movement, I started to wonder how the colored clothing associated with that movement, and did that manifest in terms of dress during that time?
I'll let Josh mostly answer that unless Ginger wants to, but part of that is because of black and white photography. So to my understanding, because people wore light purple often, it like white was a lot starker in black and white photography, and the light purple would still kind of look white.
Yeah, I know one of the things too that I read about was that they were saying like how they would use like colors to mean certain things. And I'm like forgetting exactly what it was specifically about, but it was of course kind of an antiquated idea, but it was like white would symbolize purity and purple was something to the effect of like knowledge or conviction. And then I think yellow was another color used, kind of those three colors. And I don't think in that image, it's hard to kind of see because of just like the black and white and how far zoomed out it was. But I know sometimes they would wear sashes. And I remember reading about in kind of some of the like fashion industry publications, they would talk about how, oh, they're selling, you know, these sashes or these white suits and they're requesting that, you know, people who are going to demonstrate or march would go and purchase these things. So that's part of like one of the things too, was thinking through the idea of like where that like financial barrier is and how like, you know, I mean, and of course the prices were, you know, reflective at the time. So it was like, you know, $2-3 for a sash, but at the time, I mean, that was huge for a lot of people. So I don't really know. I think that was just kind of some of the bigger suffrage organizer people that kind of came up with those meanings, or maybe drew from, you know, historical ideas of what those meanings were. I also know, I believe that there was kind of some trade-off between more so like the suffrage movement in the UK as well as with the suffrage movement here, because if I'm remembering correctly, I believe suffrage was attained in the UK sooner than it was here. So I believe that they might have been kind of drawing some some influence from the success they had with that movement as well. Oh, yeah.
What kind of things you're working on now? I know that with the trans, only trans garment, that's part of the business, but how can we look at our current culture, climate situation, and predict what those marginalized identities will be and proactively advocate for the question.
Yeah, so kind of a quick point about the Olympic sweater. So the point with that one is that Eric C. Wilson, he made it to the Olympics. However, he did not make it to the finals to compete in the 400 meters versus his two Black teammates. They won like first and second place. So kind of talking about how this white person that was essentially like made it to the Olympics, good for him, but didn't medal, and how we have his garments and they've been saved and collected and valued. And when doing research on his two teammates, Ned Gordon and D.R. Hubbard, there's very, very little research on him. I don't know if anybody's familiar with the Wayback Machine on the internet. I had to kind of use that to go find articles about these two individuals, and they medaled in the Olympics, and there's nothing about them. But I think that to your point about how we can kind of try to predict and collect with intention going forward, I think the biggest part is to kind of focus on and work with marginalized communities that exist right now. So with Kyra's point of working with trans YouTubers, with undergarments, that's a really good point. I think that something that's really big now too as well is kind of focusing on small businesses, DIY practices, Black-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses in general. And those partnerships are very important. A lot of institutions are really focusing on that. A new trend as well, or something in the museum world that's kind of happening right now, is that when making these socially just exhibitions or exhibitions focused on marginalized individuals, that you work with these communities to create these exhibitions and to kind of work with them with your collecting practices to make sure that they're going to be the most truthful and authentic as possible.
Yeah, and then like, so one of the ways that I've been thinking about that as well was through, kind of like curious. Thank you. So kind of like Kyra said, I'm curating an exhibit about Luis Estevez, who is a bisexual Cuban-American designer who essentially isn't mentioned anywhere in mainstream fashion histories at all, despite being very, well acquainted with and talked about in the same circles as people like Oscar de la Renta, who we may have all heard of, maybe Rudy Gernreich, people like that. And so one of the ways where, so unfortunately Estevez passed away, so there's not really a way to, reach out, possibly do an oral history with him. However, one of the things I've been really trying to do is utilize, he did a lot of interviews in Women's Wear Daily. And so utilizing those direct quotations from him, so he can talk, even though he's not here with us, he can talk about his design philosophy, the way he did his business, things like that. And in that way, it's really helpful just because it allows like his voice to come through rather than like my voice as the researcher. And I think that's important because then that way we're able, because we don't have any, I mean, the designer pieces that we have currently in our collection are almost exclusively by people who are white or white appearing. So the idea of kind of like branching out and making sure that our collection is more representative of histories that were occurring. I mean, Estevez was active from like the 50s until the 90s. So he had a long, illustrious career designing for really famous people like former First Lady Betty Ford, Faye Dunaway, those types of people. And yet, there's not much about him. So just kind of being like really mindful, I guess, and purposeful about like who we're trying to spotlight, as well as how we're letting their voices come through, especially if we can't, necessarily do an oral history with them or talk to them directly.
That being said, because my participants are the people who are making the objects for the trans YouTuber exhibition, I am doing oral histories with each of the people that are making these garments, so that, again, to like decenter my voice and hear I mean, you got some of the information from the videos, but it has been very enlightening conducting these oral histories with these trans YouTubers to kind of see like why they're making these videos, learning a lot about community building and personal storytelling, and how you know, some people just wanted to make them more accessible to other people, but some people were like, I just needed to do it for me, to tell someone how I was feeling and just express myself and get that out to the world as like a form of journaling. So they're very interesting. And I think, yeah, conducting oral histories when possible, when collecting contemporary objects, is important, because that's how we, you know, help document what's going on for future. And there's another kind of similar project done a couple of years ago at the museum, where the curator or the director of the museum interviewed people from several like queer and trans owned like fashion brands, and she collected objects from a lot of these brands as well. I don't think all of the brands, but now she has the oral histories and was able to use them to help contextualize these garments and the stories of queer and trans brands, because no one else is collecting these stories in an academic setting, or I shouldn't say no one, very few other people. So hopefully this will be helpful to like some imagined posterity. That I don't love that because that's like very like heterosexual, like, you know, production thing. But like, you know, for people in the future that are curious about what's going on right now, oral histories are very helpful. So I think that helps a lot in promoting equity in our collection processes now. So.
Yeah, I think we only have a few minutes left. So we'd like to thank everybody for coming and listening to our presentation, asking questions. And again, yeah, check out our digital exhibition or visit the physical exhibition for another 2 weeks in Morrill Hall in the Mary Alice Gallery. So that'll be on the first floor.
Let's thank them one more time.
Thank you, guys.